Scientists shocked after finding 10,000-year-old advanced tools. 10,000 years ago, humans were not supposed to know how to do this, and yet buried deep beneath layers of earth, sealed by time and silence, scientists uncovered tools so precise, so controlled, that they seem to belong to a much later age, an age of metal, of measurement, of design, not an age of survival and instinct, because everything we think we know about that time tells a very different story, a story where humans were still adapting to the end of the Ice Age, still learning how to farm, still shaping rough stones into simple blades, and yet these objects do not fit that story, they resist it, they challenge it, and the more closely they are studied, the more uncomfortable the contradiction becomes, because if these tools are truly 10,000 years old, then something in our understanding of history is not just incomplete, it may be fundamentally wrong. For a long time, the narrative of early human civilization has followed a predictable path, one that begins with small groups of hunter-gatherers moving across vast landscapes, using basic tools made from stone, bone, and wood, tools that were effective but crude, shaped by necessity rather than precision, and over thousands of years this simplicity gradually evolved into complexity, agriculture emerged, settlements formed, and eventually cities appeared, bringing with them writing, architecture, and advanced craftsmanship. This slow progression has been supported by countless discoveries across different continents, each reinforcing the idea that innovation came step by step, generation by generation, without sudden leaps, without anomalies that could not be explained. That is why the discovery of these tools created such a quiet but profound disturbance among researchers, because at first glance, they appear ordinary, just fragments of shaped stone, easily dismissed as typical artifacts from an ancient site, but under closer examination, details begin to emerge that should not be there, edges that are too straight, too consistent, surfaces that are too smooth, too refined, and patterns that repeat with a level of accuracy that suggests intention rather than coincidence, and it is this repetition, this consistency, that begins to separate these objects from everything else found in the same time period, because randomness can create unusual shapes, but it cannot easily create uniformity. Initially, scientists considered the simplest explanation, that something in the site had been disturbed, that the layers of soil had shifted over time, allowing newer objects to sink into older ground, a process known to happen under certain conditions, and if that were the case, then the mystery would dissolve. The tools would simply belong to a later civilization, misplaced but not extraordinary. However, when multiple dating methods were applied, the results did not support this idea. The surrounding materials, organic remains, and sediment layers all pointed to the same time frame, consistently placing the tools in a period approximately 10,000 years ago, and with each confirmation, the possibility of contamination became less likely. What made the situation even more complex was the microscopic analysis of the tools themselves, because under magnification, the marks left behind during their creation revealed a level of control that is difficult to reconcile with what we know about early toolmaking techniques. Traditional stone tools from that era are typically shaped through direct percussion, striking one rock against another to produce sharp edges, a method that is effective but inherently imprecise, producing variations that are easy to recognize, yet these newly discovered artifacts show signs of controlled pressure flaking, a technique that allows for finer shaping, more deliberate angles, and greater symmetry, a method that requires not just skill, but practice and consistency over time. One particular piece drew significant attention, a blade-like object formed from an unusually dense type of stone, its edge so fine and uniform that it closely resembles much later forms of craftsmanship, and the angles along its sides are not random but measured, repeating in a way that suggests the maker had a clear intention and possibly even a conceptual design in mind before the tool was created. And when researchers attempted to replicate the same structure using only the techniques known from that period, the results fell short, not entirely impossible, but significantly less refined, requiring far more time and precision than expected for a mobile hunter-gatherer group focused primarily on survival. At this point, the first layer of explanation begins to show its limitations, because while it is possible that early humans were more skilled than we assume, the presence of multiple such tools, all sharing similar characteristics, suggests that this was not the work of a single unusually talented individual, but rather part of a broader system, a shared knowledge passed between people, refined and repeated, and systems like that rarely exist in isolation. They require communication, teaching, and stability, conditions that are not typically associated with small, constantly moving groups. This leads to a deeper and more unsettling possibility, that our understanding of human societies during this time may be incomplete, that alongside the simple camps and temporary shelters, there may have been pockets of stability, places where people stayed longer than expected, where knowledge could accumulate rather than reset with each migration. And recent archaeological findings from other regions have started to support this idea in subtle ways, showing evidence of semi-permanent structures, organized living spaces, and repeated activity zones that suggest planning rather than improvisation. If such environments existed, even on a small scale, they could have provided the conditions necessary for more advanced techniques to develop, slowly at first, almost invisibly, until they reached a level that now appears out of place when viewed through the lens of traditional timelines. And this possibility does not break the rules of history, but it stretches them, forcing us to reconsider how quickly complexity can emerge under the right circumstances. However, even this explanation does not fully resolve the mystery, because there are still aspects of the tools that remain difficult to account for, particularly the level of uniformity seen across multiple artifacts, which suggests not just shared knowledge, but a degree of standardization, something closer to a process than an experiment. And standardization implies repetition on a scale that is hard to achieve without a larger, more organized group. Some researchers have proposed that these tools may represent a transitional phase, a brief period of accelerated innovation that did not last, possibly disrupted by environmental changes, population shifts, or resource scarcity. And if that were the case, then what we are seeing is not evidence of a lost advanced civilization, but rather a moment in time where human ingenuity briefly moved faster than the conditions around it could sustain, leaving behind fragments that now seem out of place. Others suggest a different perspective, one that focuses not on the people themselves, but on the materials they used, arguing that certain types of stone, under specific conditions, can produce unusually clean fractures and smoother surfaces, creating the illusion of advanced craftsmanship when in reality the effect is partially natural, enhanced by human effort but not entirely dependent on it. And while this explanation accounts for some features, it struggles to explain the repeated patterns and consistent angles observed across different pieces. As the debate continues, new studies have begun to add another layer to the story, using advanced imaging techniques and experimental archaeology to better understand how these tools were made. And in controlled environments, researchers have attempted to recreate the same forms using only the resources available 10,000 years ago. And while some progress has been made, the results often require levels of patience, precision, and repetition that suggest a dedicated focus, not something easily integrated into a purely survival-based lifestyle. This brings us to a quiet but important shift in perspective, because instead of asking whether these tools are too advanced for their time, some scientists are beginning to ask a different question: what if our definition of that time is too narrow? What if we have underestimated not just the abilities of early humans, but the diversity of their behaviors, their environments, and their ways of organizing knowledge? And if that is true, then these tools are not anomalies, they are signals. Small pieces of evidence pointing toward a more complex and less predictable human story. Imagine holding one of these tools in your hand, feeling the weight of it, the balance, the precision of its edge, and knowing that it was shaped by someone who lived 10,000 years ago, someone who understood their material well enough to control it, to shape it with intention. And in that moment, the distance between past and present begins to shrink, because the person who made it was not fundamentally different, not less capable, not less thoughtful, just living in a world we are still trying to understand. And perhaps that is why this discovery matters, not because it proves that history is wrong, but because it reminds us that history is incomplete, that beneath the layers we have already uncovered, there are still stories waiting, not dramatic revelations or impossible technologies, but quiet complexities that challenge our assumptions and invite us to look again, more carefully, at what we think we know, because sometimes the most important discoveries are not the ones that give us answers, but the ones that make us realize how many questions remain. And the questions do not stop there, because once you accept that something about these tools does not fit, the next step is unavoidable. You begin to ask not just how they were made, but who made them, and more importantly, how knowledge like this could exist, survive, and then disappear without leaving clearer traces behind, because history, as we understand it, is built on continuity. Ideas evolve, techniques improve, and knowledge passes from one generation to the next. But here, something feels interrupted, as if a line was drawn and then suddenly erased. As researchers continued to examine the site, they noticed something that had initially been overlooked: the spatial arrangement of the tools themselves. Because they were not scattered randomly as one might expect from a temporary campsite, instead, they appeared in clusters, subtle groupings that suggested designated areas for specific activities, one section showing evidence of shaping and refinement, Another indicating repeated use, almost like a workspace divided by purpose, and while this alone does not prove advanced organization, it introduces a level of structure that feels unusually deliberate for the time period. This observation led to a deeper investigation into the surrounding environment, and what emerged was a picture that slowly began to shift. The area was not just a place people pass through, it may have been somewhere they returned to, again and again, over extended periods, and with repetition comes familiarity, and with familiarity comes improvement, small refinements accumulating over time until the results begin to look intentional rather than experimental, and this is where the line between survival and innovation starts to blur. But even with this possibility, there remains a critical gap, because repeated visits and stable environments can explain gradual improvement, but they do not easily explain the level of consistency seen across multiple tools, consistency that suggests shared standards, a kind of unspoken agreement about how something should be made, and that implies communication, teaching, and perhaps even roles within a group, individuals who specialized, who practiced the same motions over and over until they achieved a level of precision that others could recognize and replicate. This is where some scientists begin to introduce a more controversial idea, one that does not rely on lost civilizations or unknown technologies, but instead focuses on the human mind itself, suggesting that under the right conditions, cognitive development may express itself differently than we expect, that intelligence is not a linear progression tied strictly to time, but something that can emerge in pockets, intensify, and then fade depending on environmental pressures, resources, and social structures. And if that is true, then what we are seeing in these tools may be evidence of a localized peak, a moment where human capability briefly aligned with opportunity. However, this idea brings its own complications, because if such peaks existed, why do we not see more evidence of them elsewhere? Why are these tools so rare, so isolated, and why does the broader archaeological record still appear so consistent with the traditional timeline? And one possible answer lies not in the presence of evidence, but in its absence, because preservation is selective, most materials decay, most traces disappear, and what survives is often more a matter of chance than representation, meaning that entire chapters of human history could have existed without leaving enough behind for us to recognize them. To explore this further, scientists turn to experimental archaeology, attempting not just to replicate the tools, but to understand the process behind them, recreating the conditions, using similar materials, and limiting themselves to techniques that would have been available at the time. And what they discovered was both encouraging and frustrating, because while it was possible to produce similar shapes, achieving the same level of precision required an extraordinary amount of time and repetition, far more than expected, suggesting that whoever made the original tools was not working casually, but with focus and intention, possibly over long periods. This raises an important question, one that shifts the focus from ability to priority, because if early humans were capable of this level of craftsmanship, why invest so much time in it? What was the purpose? And this is where interpretations begin to diverge again. Some researchers believe the tools were purely functional, designed for specific tasks that required greater precision, such as processing certain materials or performing delicate operations, while others suggest a more symbolic role, that the tools may have held meaning beyond their utility, representing status, identity, or even early forms of cultural expression. And then there is a third possibility, one that sits somewhere between function and symbolism, suggesting that the act of making these tools was itself important, that the process served as a form of knowledge transmission, a way to teach patience, control, and understanding of materials, skills that would be valuable beyond the tools themselves. And if that is the case, then these artifacts are not just objects, they are evidence of learning, of teaching, of minds shaping other minds across generations. As new technologies were applied to the study, including high-resolution scanning and microscopic residue analysis, another layer of detail began to emerge, traces of materials that hinted at how the tools were used, subtle wear patterns that suggested repeated, controlled motions rather than rough, improvised use, and in some cases, residues that could not be easily identified, adding yet another unanswered question to the growing list, because every answer seemed to open a new uncertainty. At this point, the mystery is no longer about whether the tools are advanced, but about how we define advancement itself, because perhaps what we are seeing is not an exception to the rule, but a reminder that the rule was never as rigid as we believed, that human history is not a straight line, but a landscape with peaks and valleys, moments of rapid insight followed by periods of simplicity, not because knowledge was lost entirely, but because it was no longer needed, or no longer sustainable. Under changing conditions. Imagine standing in that ancient space, watching as someone carefully shapes a piece of stone, repeating the same motion again and again, adjusting pressure, refining angles, learning through touch and observation, and around them, others watch, not passively, but attentively, absorbing the process, understanding not just what to do, but how to do it, and in that moment, the distance between what we call primitive and what we call advanced begins to dissolve, replaced by something more continuous, more human. And maybe that is the deeper truth hidden within this discovery, not that ancient humans were secretly modern, or that history is built on a single mistake, but that intelligence, creativity, and precision have always been part of who we are, appearing wherever the conditions allow, even if only briefly, even if only in ways that are difficult for us to recognize at first. Because in the end, these tools do not just tell us about the past, they reflect something about ourselves, about how we learn, how we adapt, and how easily we can underestimate what is possible when we assume that progress must follow a single, predictable path. And perhaps the real mystery is not how these tools were made, but how many other moments like this have already been lost, waiting silently beneath the surface, just out of reach. If this story made you think differently about history, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who enjoys questioning what we think we know, because sometimes the most important discoveries begin with a simple question that refuses to go away.